Well, I don't have a hat, but I do have
mine.
I have a tie given to me by the organizers, and from J Press. I've never felt more Yale-like in my life, and I appreciate it. Max Boot should probably be the director of a restored USIA. I think he knows what he's doing, what ought to be done. Elliott Abrams should be Secretary of State, but we'll have to wait for brighter times. I have jotted down a series of points I wish to make, or observations, and in the interest of getting them all in, or most of them in, I don't think I'll bother stitching them together too much. In other words, it'll be exactly like my web column. I wish to say that I dabble in communism and anti-communism, past and present. I'll give you an example of the past. My next piece in National Review is sort of a profile of Natalia Solzhenitsyn, the widow of the writer, who is very, very busy heading the Solzhenitsyn Archive, which is a huge project, as you can imagine. And so my piece is an historical piece in a way, but of course, endless relevance. And I work quite a bit with Cuban exiles, Chinese exiles, on issues of Cuban and Chinese human rights and democracy. I do a lot of this, and sometimes, in fact, often people ask me, why this great interest in Cuba and China? I should do more about North Korea and Vietnam, Laos, Nepal. I think those are the remaining communist states. China has a lot of people in it. Communism is not a thing of the past for a great many, but a very serious problem of the present. And they ask, why do you spend so much time? One answer is that it's right to do and interesting to do and satisfying to do. But another answer is that very few do it. You have the field almost to yourself. I used to say, I think it's probably less true now than when I started to say this maybe 15 years ago, that if a Palestinian kid falls in Ramallah and skins his knee, you'll read about it in the New York Times. But you can be tortured to death in the Cuban or North Korean or Chinese gulag, and no one will ever find out about it. And so we all do our bit. When I was coming of age, when I was a college student, there was a lot of yapping about human rights. Some of it was quite good yapping. But I'll tell you what the people around me meant primarily. They meant human rights in Pinochet's Chile, Marcos's Philippines, and above all, apartheid South Africa. That was the great cause, the great human rights cause, the great moral cause of that time. I knew who the players in South Africa were very, very well. I knew the names of political prisoners. I knew the political actors. I think I knew the politics of South Africa better than I did the politics of my hometown. There was great concentration on South Africa. They were banned from the Olympics for many, many years. In the meantime, the Olympics were held in Moscow, etc. A couple of words about Cuba and our relative indifference to the suffering of Cubans, ordinary Cubans, but also dissidents, prisoners of conscience, people who starve themselves to death, for example, in hunger strikes. Why are they going to these extremes? I've spoken to a great many people about this problem, our indifference to Cuba, and I recall Jeane Kirkpatrick saying it was one of the most puzzling and painful phenomena of our times. There are many people, but I think of one in particular, a man who ought to be famous. He ought to be on the cover of Time and Newsweek. Do we still have covers of Time and Newsweek? Anyway, he ought to be a big deal. There ought to be songs about him, poetry, movies of the week. He ought to be on 60 Minutes every other week. It's a man named Oscar Bisset. He's a heroic man, a brave man, an inspiring man. A practitioner of nonviolence. He was in the Cuban gulag, as I don't blush to call it, for 12 years, got out last year, I think. I interviewed him as soon as I could. He's a follower of Gandhi and Martin Luther King. He's just perfect. He's even black, but no one cares. Absolutely, the Che Guevara is on almost every T-shirt, and no one knows who Oscar Bisset is. And they stand on opposite sides of a great divide, Che Guevara and Oscar Bisset. He's someone who ought to win the Nobel Peace Prize, Bisset. You could give it to the ladies in white. These people who began, there were wives and sisters and daughters and so on, of political prisoners caught up in the so-called Black Spring. Wonderful group. They are beaten and beaten severely for what they do. They hold candlelight vigils and the like. and the state just can't stand it and makes things very difficult for them. Let me quote to you Armando Valladares, who used to be known, I guess is still known by some of us, as the Cuban Solzhenitsyn. He wrote a once famous and important memoir called Against All Hope. He said, if the Cuban dictatorship were right-wing instead of left-wing, we'd have won 2 or 3 Nobel Prizes already. And that may well be so. Final quick point about Cuba. I was saying the other day in the office, to the objection of some of my colleagues, that the left, if I may, so often sets the agenda. They determine what we talk about. Even if we disagree, people like us here disagree, they determine what we talk about. And there's a man named Alan Gross, and Elliot Abram knows plenty about him, and he's been a hostage in Cuba for about 3 years. In fact, I think it'll be 3 years next month, which is to say tomorrow. Yep. He is not just some ordinary American schmo in Cuba. He's not some hippie traveler. He's an official, or at least quasi-official, American aid worker, a USAID contract worker. He's been a hostage, this American, basically, of this dictatorship 90 miles from our shore for 3 years. Very, very little attention. It is a puzzling and painful phenomenon. Quick word about China. I think Henry Kissinger said some years ago that the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese state, they were really today something like Mexico and the PRI. That may be, but I'm reminded very often, certainly by what I receive in my email, that it's still, for all of its changes, let's face it, a one-party dictatorship with a gulag called Laogai. And in the West, this word is not famous. I think Solzhenitsyn primarily made the word gulag famous. It began as an acronym, you know. We used to spell it with all capital letters, and then it got more normalized, and then we went capital G and then lowercase letters. But the word Laogai is not as well known. It is the Chinese gulag. And there are people, particularly Falun Gong practitioners, who are tortured to death in this system, certainly every week, if not every day. In China, there are very serious allegations, I believe them, of organ harvesting. This is a huge story, and the media, the world, is relatively indifferent. And I recall something that Robert Conquest said. He said, people will find out about these things later, and they'll say, how shocking, no one said anything. Not true. There are those who say things now. Ethan Gutman, as far as I know, is the foremost English-speaking expert on this issue of organ harvesting in China. And I think he is a kind of prophet or early truth teller, maybe a William Henry Chamberlain type. There were a handful who told the truth about the Soviet Union way back before it was cool. If it's cool today, how about this stance of the world on China and little Taiwan, this plucky little liberal democracy? It is a true liberal democracy, putting the lie to this idea that liberal democracy and Asia are incompatible, as South Korea puts the lie to it, and other people have put the lie to it. Let me tell you about Davos, the World Economic Forum, which is a pretty big deal. All the poobahs meet there every year in January, and everyone's there, good, bad, and different. I mean nations and governments. In my time at Davos, I've seen, for example, representatives of Saddam Hussein's regime, and certainly representatives of the mullah's regime in Tehran. I sat next to the foreign minister once. That was kind of a creepy experience. But guess who's missing? Taiwan. These Democrats in Taiwan are not invited because China would be upset. There are more interests, and we have more interest in China than human rights. And Hillary Clinton said at the beginning of her tenure as Secretary of State, I think it was February 2009, that human rights would have to go on the back burner because there were more pressing concerns like, I quote, climate change. That may be so. That may be so. Human rights are not the be-all and end-all of foreign policy, as Max Boot knows and Elliot Abram knows, and we all know. I think I've said Abram twice. It's hard to get that S out, Elliot. Elliot Abrams, beg your pardon. But I'm reminded of something Bukowski once said. He said, he was talking about Western policymakers. And he said, you know, do what you got to do. But every once in a while, pause to ask yourself this question. How will it look to the boys in the camps? The boys in the camps who find out about things, how will it look to them, what you're doing? You remember Sharansky had these Bible readings with a fellow prisoner of his, a Christian named Volodya, for a while when it was allowed. And they called their readings, their sessions, Reaganite readings, because they had heard somehow that Reagan had proclaimed some year, after 1983 or something, the year of the Bible. We all laugh, year of the Bible, what a load of, what a stupid motherhood and apple pie, congressional, year of the Bible, give me a break. It really meant something to those two. And something like that can mean things to others. The Nobel Peace Committee did, after 60 years of passing over Chinese Democrats and human rights activists and dissidents and prisoners, after 60 years, they gave the Peace Prize to a leader of Charter 08, Liu Xiaobo, who sits in prison today. Imagine that. Imagine a Nobel Peace Laureate sitting in prison. And President Obama the other day hailed a spirit of cooperation between the United States and China. And maybe there's an argument for that. But these two guys are fellow Nobel Peace Laureates, Obama and Liu. And there ought to be some attention. Final thing about China. In 2010, we, the United States, held human rights talks with China. And this is something that puzzled me greatly. We're a liberal democracy. They're a one-party dictatorship with a gulag. We held human rights talks with them. And afterward, or after one session, the press had questions for our guy, who was an assistant secretary of state, I believe, named Michael Posner. I think he's assistant secretary of state for democracy or something like that. And the press said, mind you, these were talks with the Chinese communists who torture Tibetans and others every single day. Our guy in the press said, did the Arizona immigration law come up? And if it did come up, did you bring it up or did they? And Posner said, we did, early and often, to show that we too have problems in our society. This is what we used to call in the bad old days moral equivalence, and it is not gone. Final remarks. Did you see this video the other day of that professor at Montclair State University, a public university in New Jersey, denying that the Soviet Union had ever killed anybody? He wrote a book called Khrushchev Lied. In other words, he lied in the secret speech when he said that Stalin had liquidated a few communist officials. You know, Khrushchev didn't own up to much in that secret speech. It was a blockbuster thing, but he didn't own up to all that much. And here's a guy, I believe in academic freedom, blah, 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 but let me just ask you. Would we have a Holocaust denier on the faculty? Really? Really? I wonder. The aforementioned Bob Conquest, he said, this was in an interview with me a few years ago, in the academy there remains a feeling of, don't let's be too rude to Stalin. He's British, you see. Don't let's be too rude to Stalin. He was a bad guy, yes, but the Americans were bad guys too, and so was the British Empire. Eric Hobsbawm has died, an apologist for Soviet communism, including Stalin. The recipient of, I think, 53 honorary degrees, Bob Conquest, who told the truth about the Soviet Union, won one honorary degree from Adelphi University when it was run by a sadly corrupt president, I believe, who admired Bob. That says something about academia. It says something about the world. Did you see this poster from the EU showing all the symbols of Europe? It showed a cross, a Star of David, a Muslim crescent, and so on, and the hammer and sickle. And there was a bit of there's an outcry from the Lithuanians. And I asked, why does it take the Lithuanians? Why aren't we in the West sympathetic enough to sufferers, to the persecuted under communism, to object ourselves? Why leave it to these Balts? But there it was.